The night air holds a particular stillness, and in this quietness there exists a world preserved in ink and wood, a world where mountains rise in graduated shades of blue, where waves curl with geometric precision, where cherry blossoms drift across paper skies that have remained unchanged for centuries. I find myself drawn tonight into the realm of Japanese woodblock prints, those remarkable images created through patience and collaboration, through the careful carving of wooden blocks and the deliberate application of color, layer upon patient layer, until an image emerges that seems both impossibly simple and infinitely complex. These prints exist in a space between art and craft, between the singular vision of an artist and the collective skill of many hands. And tonight, as thoughts begin to drift like pigment dispersing in water, I am tracing the journey of how these images came to be, how they evolved over centuries, and how they captured moments of beauty with such clarity that they still speak across the span of time. There is something about the process itself that invites contemplation, the way a design must be conceived in reverse, the way each color requires its own block, its own moment of pressure and release, the way registration marks ensure that each layer aligns perfectly with the last, creating images through accumulation, through the steady building of hues and lines until a complete world materializes on mulberry paper. The prints themselves often depict simple scenes, a courtesan pausing in a doorway, a fisherman bracing against the spray, an actor frozen in a moment of theatrical intensity. Yet within these seemingly straightforward images lie depths of technical mastery and aesthetic philosophy that reveal themselves slowly, like details emerging from morning mist. Tonight the focus settles on the grain of cherry wood, seasoned and cut along the plank, its surface waiting to receive the artist's design, and I imagine the transfer of that design, brushed onto thin paper, laid face down against the wood, then rubbed away until only the lines remain, embedded in the surface, ready to guide the carver's tools. The carver works with blades of different sizes, some broad, some fine as needles, each cut made with consideration, removing what must be removed, leaving raised what will receive the ink, creating a topography of image and absence, and this carved surface becomes a kind of archive, a physical record of artistic intention that can be inked and pressed again and again, each impression a ghost of the original, yet somehow complete unto itself. Water-based inks pool in shallow dishes, each color mixed to precise specifications, and the printer applies these inks with brushes made from bamboo, sheathed in hemp fiber. The dampened paper receives each layer, absorbing pigment into its fibers, and between each printing there is waiting, allowing one color to set before the next is applied, a rhythm of action and patience that stretches across days. These prints were never meant to be rare. They were created in editions, sometimes hundreds of impressions from a single set of blocks, meant for townspeople and merchants, for those who could not afford painted scrolls, but who hungered for beauty nonetheless. And yet this very accessibility, this democratic distribution of art, became part of their enduring power. The subjects they chose tell stories of a floating world, ukiyo, a concept that speaks to the transient nature of pleasure, of beauty, of life itself. And in capturing these fleeting moments, the printmakers created something paradoxical. They made the ephemeral permanent. They froze the flowing world in blocks of cherry wood and layers of mineral pigment. As I consider these images tonight, I see them not just as pictures, but as windows into a particular way of seeing, a cultural perspective that found profound beauty in the everyday, in the curve of a courtesan's neck, in the pattern of rain against a bridge, in the startled expression of a kabuki performer, and this attention to the momentary, to the specific and small, creates an intimacy across centuries. The light from a paper lantern, the fold of a kimono, the distant outline of a Mount Fuji. These elements repeat across thousands of prints, familiar motifs that anchor the viewer in a recognizable world. Yet each artist brought their own vision, their own innovations of composition and color, their own understanding of how to balance negative space with intricate detail. And so tonight, as thoughts begin to settle into the slower rhythms of contemplation, I am entering this world of woodblock prints, not as a distant observer, but as someone tracing the evolution of a tradition, following the path from its earliest influences through centuries of refinement, watching as techniques developed and styles shifted, as masters emerged and left their indelible marks, as an entire visual language came into being, one careful impression at a time. The story begins long before the islands of Japan developed their own distinctive printing tradition. It begins across the sea in China, where the art of woodblock printing emerged more than 1,000 years ago, during the Tang Dynasty, when Buddhist monks sought ways to reproduce sacred texts and images, to spread teachings across vast distance. And they discovered that carved wooden blocks, inked and pressed against paper, could create identical copies, each one a perfect echo of the original. These early Chinese prints were primarily textual, sutras, and religious documents, though images of the Buddha and Bodhisattvas also appeared, radiating calm from their wooden matrices, and the technology traveled along trade routes, moving through Korea, carried by monks and merchants until it reached Japan sometime in the 8th century, arriving with Buddhism itself, inseparable from the faith it served. The earliest Japanese woodblock prints were called suramono, small devotional images, and hyakumanto durani, tiny printed prayers inserted into miniature wooden pagodas, created under the patronage of Empress Shotoku around 764. These were not art in the sense we might understand it. They were spiritual technology, tools for generating merit, for multiplying prayers through reproduction. And yet they established the fundamental technique, the marriage of wood and ink and paper that would eventually give birth to something entirely new. For centuries, so printing in Japan remained primarily in service of religion and scholarship. Buddhist temples produced illustrated sutras. Confucian texts were reproduced for study, and the technique refined itself slowly through generations of anonymous craftsmen who learned the resistance of different woods, the behavior of various inks, the proper dampness of paper, knowledge accumulated grain by grain, like sediment settling into strata. The political landscape of Japan during these early centuries shaped what could be printed and who could print it. The country existed under strict feudal control, with power concentrated in the hands of the shogunate and regional lords, the daimyo, and the vast majority of people lived in agricultural villages bound to the land, with little access to literacy or luxury. The world of printing remained confined to temples and the estates of nobility, removed from common life. But beneath this rigid surface, currents were shifting. By the early 1600s, Japan had endured more than a century of civil war, the Sengoku period, the age of warring states, and when Tokugawa Ieyasu finally unified the country in 1603, establishing the Tokugawa shogunate, he created conditions that would inadvertently nurture a remarkable flowering of urban culture. The Tokugawa regime implemented a policy of national isolation, sakoku, closing Japan's borders to nearly all foreign contact, permitting only limited trade through the port of Nagasaki. And this inward turn, this centuries-long pause in external engagement, created a kind of cultural greenhouse where Japanese arts developed according to their own internal logic, evolving forms that owed little to continental influence, that spoke in distinctly Japanese visual vocabularies. Within this closed system, cities began to grow. Edo, which would later become Tokyo, swelled into one of the largest cities in the world, with a population approaching 1 million by the early 1700s. And alongside it, Osaka and Kyoto thrived as centers of commerce and culture. And within these urban spaces, a new social class emerged, the chonin, the townspeople, merchants and artisans who, despite their low rank in the official Confucian hierarchy, possessed wealth and leisure and hunger for entertainment. These urban populations created demand for what would become known as ukiyo-shu, pictures of the floating world, a term that captured something essential about the philosophy of these new city dwellers. The Buddhist concept of ukiyo originally meant the sorrowful world of suffering and rebirth, but the townspeople repurposed it, transforming its meaning into something more hedonistic. The floating world became the realm of pleasure, of theaters and tea houses, of beautiful courtesans and famous actors, of transient delights to be savored before they vanished like morning dew. The earliest ukiyo-e were paintings, single works created by artists like Hishikawa Moronobu, who worked in the late 1600s. His paintings depicted the pleasure quarters of Edo, the Yoshiwara district, where courtesans moved through carefully choreographed rituals of seduction and display, and his compositions showed these women in moments of elegant repose, their kimonos decorated with intricate patterns, their hair arranged in elaborate styles that required hours to construct and identified their rank and house at a glance. Moronobu understood that demand existed for these images beyond the wealthy few who could commission paintings, and he began producing woodblock prints, initially simple works in black ink only, called sumizuri. These prints depicted the same subjects as his paintings: courtesans and kabuki actors, scenes from the pleasure quarters, but they were affordable, accessible to shop clerks and artisans, to anyone with a few coins who wanted to bring beauty into their modest homes. These early prints were crude by later standards, single-color impressions with broad lines and minimal detail, but they established the genres that would dominate ukiyo-e for the next 2 centuries: bijinga, pictures of beautiful women, and yakusha-e, prints of kabuki actors, both subjects drawn from the licensed pleasure quarters, the only spaces in rigid Tokugawa society where a degree of freedom and fantasy could flourish. The process of creating these prints required collaboration. The artist designed the image, creating a master drawing, but then the work passed to the carver, the horishi, who transferred the design to wood, typically cherry, and carved away the negative space, leaving raised lines that would receive ink, and finally to the printer, the Surishi, who applied ink to the block and pressed paper against it, using a flat tool called a baran, rubbing in circular motions to transfer the image, each impression requiring judgment and skill to achieve the proper density and clarity. For decades, these prints remained monochromatic, though sometimes color was added by hand after printing, brushed onto individual impressions, a painstaking process that limited production, but the desire for color, for images that could capture the brilliance of kimono fabrics and the flush of cosmetics, drove technical innovation, and printmakers experimented with ways to introduce color through the printing process itself. The breakthrough came gradually, first with tani prints, where red lead pigment was applied by hand to black impressions, then with Benazuri prints using 2 or 3 blocks to add colors, typically pink and green, to the basic black key block impression. These were registered using marks called kento, small notches cut into the corner and edge of each block, against which the paper was positioned to ensure each color layer aligned precisely with the others. By the 1730s and 40s, artists like Okumura Masanobu were producing increasingly sophisticated benizuri, images where color began to play a structural role, defining space and creating atmosphere, not merely decorating a black outline, and the prints grew larger, more ambitious in composition, incorporating perspective techniques borrowed from Western art, though filtered through Japanese aesthetic sensibilities, creating hybrid spaces that felt both familiar and strange. The collaborative nature of print production meant that innovation could come from any point in the process. A carver might discover a new way to suggest texture. A printer might experiment with gradation, blending colors on a single block to create effects called bokashi, where pigment shifted from dark to light across a passage of sky or water. And publishers, the Hanmoto, who financed production and coordinated between artists and craftsmen, played crucial roles in pushing technical boundaries, seeking competitive advantages in an increasingly crowded marketplace. These publishers operated from shops clustered in specific districts of Edo. They maintained stables of artists and relationships with skilled carvers and printers. They tracked popular trends, knowing when actor prints would sell and when landscape scenes might find favor, and they navigated the censorship regulations imposed by the shogunate, which periodically cracked down on images deemed too luxurious or morally corrupting, requiring publishers to submit prints for approval, receiving seals that permitted sale. The world captured in these early prints feels both distant and immediate. Courtesans pose in rooms with tatami mats and sliding shoji screens. Their robes cascade in complex folds that demonstrate the artist's skill at rendering textile patterns. Kabuki actors freeze mid-gesture, their faces painted in the distinctive kumadori style. Bold patterns of red and blue that identified character types, heroes and villains, ghosts and demons, and behind these figures, minimal backgrounds suggest interior spaces or garden views, just enough context to anchor the scene without competing with the main subject. What's remarkable about these early prints is their essential restraint. Even as technical capabilities increased, the aesthetic remained fundamentally about economy of means, about suggesting depth with a few carefully placed lines, about using negative space as actively as marked areas. And this restraint wasn't limitation. It was philosophy, an understanding that emptiness held power, that what was left unsaid could resonate as strongly as what was depicted. The transformation arrived in the year 1765, when a publisher named Harunobu Suzuki, working with carvers and printers whose names have been lost, produced the first true Nishiki-e brocade pictures, prints that used multiple blocks to achieve full color, sometimes 10 or more separate impressions layered onto a single sheet, each color requiring its own carved block, its own moment of careful registration, and suddenly the floating world bloomed into vivid life. These new full-color prints revolutionized what was possible. Courtesans could now be shown in kimono that captured the actual complexity of fabric design, patterns within patterns, flowers scattered across fields of color that themselves contained subtle variations, and the pigments available to printers expanded dramatically. Crushed minerals provided blues and greens, organic sources yielded yellows and pinks, and from Prussia came a synthetic blue, Prussian blue, Baro AI, that would transform Japanese printing with its intensity and permanence, a color so vibrant it seemed to pulse with internal light. The process of creating these multi-block prints required extraordinary coordination. The artist, now often a celebrated figure whose name appeared on the print, would create the initial design in black ink. This drawing went to the carver, who pasted it face down onto a block of cherry wood, carefully rubbing away the paper until only the lines remained, embedded in the wood grain, and then began the painstaking work of cutting away everything that should not print, using blades of varying widths, some broad as fingernails, others fine as thorns. For each color in the design, a separate block had to be carved, and the carver worked from color-separated guides provided by the artist. Knowing that the pink of a kimono lining would require one block, the pattern overlaying it another, the face and hands yet another, building up the image through stratified absence, through carefully orchestrated voids that would receive pigment, and the registration marks, the kento, had to be cut with absolute precision, because even a slight misalignment would cause colors to blur beyond their boundaries, destroying the crispness that defined the medium. Once carved, the blocks passed to the printer, and here the deepest mysteries of the craft resided, because the printer worked not from strict formulas, but from feeling, from understanding how dampness affected paper, how humidity changed ink behavior, how pressure and rubbing patterns could coax different effects from the same block. The printer would dampen sheets of paper, usually made from inner bark of mulberry trees, kozo, beaten into pulp and formed into sheets with a subtle grain that affected how pigment absorbed. The inks themselves were water-based, mixed fresh for each printing session, pigments ground and combined with rice paste to create the proper consistency. Too thick and the color would sit on the paper surface, cracking as it dried. Too thin and it would bleed beyond the carved lines, losing definition, and the printer had to judge this by eye, by experience, adjusting ratios to account for temperature, for the particular character of each batch of paper, for the depth of carving on each block. Application of ink happened with wide, flat brushes, the printer working quickly before the ink could dry on the block, spreading color in smooth strokes that filled the raised surfaces. And then the dampened paper was positioned against the kento marks, laid down onto the inked block with a whisper of contact, and the printer would take up the baron, that flat disc wrapped in bamboo sheath, and begin rubbing, applying pressure in circular patterns that transferred ink from wood to paper, learning through touch when enough pressure had been applied, when the image had fully released from the block. For a print with 10 colors, this process repeated 10 times, each impression requiring fresh ink, fresh positioning, fresh judgment about pressure and timing, and between colors, the paper had to dry, sometimes for hours, before the next layer could be added, and throughout, the printer had to maintain consistent dampness in the paper stock, because paper that dried too much would shrink, throwing off registration, while paper too wet would distort, stretching in unpredictable ways. The colors built upon each other in carefully planned sequences, typically the key block, the one carrying the black outline, printed first, establishing the structure upon which other hues would layer, and then lighter colors before darker, backgrounds before foreground details, each choice affecting what came after, because unlike Western painting, where colors could be mixed and adjusted on a palette, here each hue existed in isolation, achieving optical effects through transparency and overlay rather than physical blending. Certain techniques became signatures of master printers, bokashi, the gradation from dark to light within a single printing, achieved by wiping pigment partially away from the block, or by applying different intensities to different areas, created skies that shifted from deep blue at the zenith to pale pink at the horizon, or water that darkened toward the depths. These gradations required such skill that only the finest printers could execute them consistently, and their work commanded premium prices from publishers who understood that technical excellence attracted buyers. The subjects of these prints expanded as the medium matured, alongside courtesans and actors. Artists began depicting scenes from classical literature, moments from the tale of Genji or the tales of Ise, warriors from historical epics, cherry blossom viewing parties, snow scenes, depictions of famous places, Meisho, the 8 views of Omi, the 53 stations of the Tokaido Road, and each genre developed its own conventions, its own visual language that viewers learned to read. In Bijinga, the Prince of Beautiful Women, artists like Kitagawa Utamaro emerged in the 1780s and 90s, bringing unprecedented psychological depth to his portraits. His women were not mere decorative objects. Their faces showed complex emotions, melancholy, amusement, calculation, captured in the subtle turn of an eye or the slight purse of lips, and he developed the okubi-e format, large head pictures that filled the frame with the courtesan's face and upper body, allowing intimate examination of expression and ornament. Utamaro understood how to use themika, kira, that was sometimes dusted onto backgrounds, creating subtle sparkle that suggested luxury, and how to employ embossing, karazuri, where the block pressed into paper without ink, creating raised patterns that caught light, dimensional effects that added tactile richness, and his color choices spoke to sophisticated understanding of a harmony and contrast, placing brilliant red against muted purple, electric blue against soft gray, combinations that shouldn't work but somehow sang together. The Akusha-e actor prints captured kabuki performers in their most famous roles, and these prints functioned almost like modern publicity stills, commemorating performances, allowing fans to take home memories of theatrical experiences. Artists like Toshusai Sharaku, who worked briefly in 1794 and 95, created portraits of actors that bordered on caricature, emphasizing distinctive features, crossed eyes, jutting jaws, expressions of exaggerated emotion that captured the essence of Kabuki's stylized performance. His prints were so bold, so uncompromising in their characterization, that they allegedly offended some subjects, and his career ended almost as soon as it began, leaving behind only a handful of months' worth of work, but work so distinctive it remains instantly recognizable. Within the pleasure quarters themselves, the Yoshiwara district of Edo, prints served as advertisements and souvenirs. Courtesans were ranked in elaborate hierarchies, from the highest-ranking oiran, who paraded in magnificent robes, their hair adorned with ornaments worth small fortunes, down through various grades to common prostitutes, and bijinga often identified specific women by name, functioning as a kind of a visual directory for potential clients, though the images idealized their subjects, transforming even ordinary features into perfect oval faces with tiny mouths and gracefully elongated necks. The economics of print production created interesting dynamics because blocks could be used for multiple print runs. Popular images might be reprinted many times over years, and early impressions, pulled when the blocks were sharp and the carving crisp, showed details that later impressions lost as the wood wore down. Collectors learned to distinguish first editions from later printings by these subtle degradations, by the clarity of fine lines or the crispness of text characters, and some prints were so popular that blocks wore out entirely, requiring recarving that never quite matched the original precision. Publishers sometimes issued prints in series, sets of images united by theme, the most famous beauties of the day, the 7 gods of good fortune, acts of the Chushingura revenge story, and these series created ongoing demand, collectors wanting to acquire complete sets, returning month after month to purchase new releases, and the publishers cultivated this market, announcing upcoming designs, building anticipation, operating with commercial savvy that rivaled any modern entertainment industry. Censorship shaped what could be depicted. The Tokugawa shogunate periodically issued sumptuary laws. Attempting to restrict displays of luxury, they felt promoted moral decay. Prints showing courtesans in elaborate kimono might be banned, forcing artists to simplify dress or shift to different subjects temporarily, and political content was strictly forbidden. No criticism of authorities, no commentary on current events, which pushed artistic energy toward historical subjects, nature scenes, no mythological themes, anywhere, meaning could be embedded symbolically rather than stated directly. Yet within these restrictions, creativity flourished. Artists developed visual codes, ways of suggesting what couldn't be shown explicitly. Certain flowers indicated seasons. Certain colors implied emotional states. Compositions referenced classical poetry without including text, and knowledgeable viewers could read these layers of meaning, appreciating both the surface beauty and the deeper resonances. The way a print of plovers flying over waves might echo a poem about lovers separated by circumstance, its meaning enriched by literary association. The physical qualities of the paper itself contributed to the aesthetic. Kozo paper had a slight texture, a warmth that Western papers lacked, and it absorbed ink differently, creating soft edges rather than hard boundaries. Colors seemed to float just beneath the surface rather than sitting on top, and this quality, this slight diffusion, gave prints their characteristic softness, even when depicting dramatic subjects, battles or ghosts. There remained an underlying gentleness, a quality of the handmade that resisted mechanical precision. The 19th century arrived with changes rippling through Japanese society. Though the country remained officially closed to the world, pressures were building, both internal and external, and these tensions would eventually transform not just the political landscape, but the very nature of ukiyo-e itself, pushing the medium in directions its early practitioners could never have imagined. Within the closed system of Tokugawa Japan, economic changes were shifting power. Merchants grew wealthy while samurai, forbidden from engaging in commerce, struggled with fixed stipends that bought less each year. And this merchant class, the chonin, became ever more important patrons of the arts, their tastes shaping what publishers produced, and they demanded novelty, innovation, images that could surprise and delight even jaded urban sensibilities. Artists responded by exploring new subjects. Katsushika Hokusai, born in 1760, began his career producing conventional actor prints and illustrations, but as he matured, his interests expanded to encompass nearly everything. He drew manga, sketchbooks filled with observations of daily life, people working and playing, animals in motion, ghosts and demons, instructional diagrams showing perspective and composition. His curiosity seemed limitless, his hand able to capture anything his eye observed. In the late 1820s, when Hokusai was already in his 70s, he began work on his most famous series, 36 Views of Mount Fuji. Though the series ultimately included 46 prints, and these images transformed landscape from mere background into primary subject, Fuji appeared from countless vantages, seen from Edo, from villages along the Tokaido Road, from tea houses and rice fields and forest clearings, sometimes dominating the composition, sometimes barely visible on a distant horizon, but always present, that perfect cone anchoring the Japanese landscape, both literal mountain and spiritual symbol. The most famous print from this series, The Great Wave off Kanagawa, shows Fuji tiny and distant, barely visible beyond an enormous wave that fills the foreground. The wave curves into a claw shape, foam flying from its crest like snow, and 3 fishing boats ride the trough, their crews hunched low, about to be engulfed. The composition creates extraordinary tension between the transient violence of the wave and the eternal stillness of Fuji, between human vulnerability and natural power, and that Prussian blue imported from the West gives the water an intensity that seems almost supernatural. Hokusai's landscapes introduced compositional innovations. He used Western perspective in ways that felt natural rather than forced, creating depth through overlapping forms and atmospheric effects. Distant mountains fading to pale blue, and he wasn't afraid of bold compositions, placing horizons very high or very low, cropping elements at the frame edge, creating dynamic asymmetries that energized static scenes. A bridge cutting diagonally across the image, tree branches entering from one corner, compositional risks that paid off in prints that felt alive, that drew the eye into continuous exploration. His contemporary, Utagawa Hiroshiga, took landscape in different directions, where Hokusai's views felt monumental. Hiroshiga's were intimate, suffused with atmosphere and mood. His series 100 Famous Views of Edo, begun in 1856, captured the city through seasons, weather, times of day, showing famous temples and bridges and gardens, but also humble neighborhoods, ferries crossing rivers, views from tea houses, snow falling on bamboo groves, rain streaking across the sky, and fine parallel lines that demonstrated astonishing carving precision. Hiroshige mastered the depiction of weather. His rain prints show precipitation as lines of varying density, some vertical, some wind-blown, creating curtains of water that obscure and reveal, and his snow scenes capture that peculiar silence that comes with snowfall, flakes rendered as white spots against darker grounds, accumulating on bare branches and temple roofs, the prints somehow conveying not just the look of snow, but the muffled quiet it brings, the way it transforms familiar landscapes into something strange and beautiful. Both artists benefited from advances in printing technology, more sophisticated color gradations, finer carving that could render detail approaching the limits of human vision, and both worked with master printers who understood their artistic intentions, who could translate a sketched indication into a perfect bokashi that captured the exact quality of dawn light or evening mist, the collaboration between artist and craftsman reaching heights of integration where individual contributions became indistinguishable from the unified whole. Yet even as landscape prints flourished, other genres continued. Warrior prints, mushae, depicted famous battles and legendary heroes, samurai facing down demons or confronting human enemies. These prints often showed violence explicitly, severed heads, spurting blood, the gore rendered in the same careful technique used for cherry blossoms, creating disturbing beauty, and they satisfied audiences hungry for excitement, for narratives of courage and revenge that reflected samurai values even as actual samurai power waned. Ghost stories and supernatural subjects. Kaiden formed another popular genre. Artists like Utagawa Kuniyoshi created prints showing vengeful spirits, transformed foxes, monsters from folklore, and these images deployed the full technical arsenal of ukiyo-e, using embossing for spirit robes that seemed to float off the paper, mica backgrounds that glittered like otherworldly realms, color combinations that created unnatural, unsettling effects, purples and greens that no natural light produces, and the finest of these prints managed to be both beautiful and genuinely eerie, maintaining aesthetic refinement while depicting subjects designed to frighten. The middle decades of the 19th century brought increasing contact with the outside world. In 1853, American Commodore Matthew Perry arrived with his black ships, demanding Japan open to trade, and the centuries of isolation were ending. Within 15 years, the Tokugawa shogunate would collapse. The emperor would be restored to power in the Meiji Restoration of 1868, and Japan would begin a rapid modernization, attempting to match Western military and industrial power. These changes affected ukiyo-e profoundly. New subjects appeared, foreigners in their strange clothing, steam trains, and telegraph lines, Western-style buildings rising in Yokohama and Tokyo. Artists documented the transformation even as they participated in it, creating Yokohama-e pictures of the foreign settlement, showing bearded Westerners in top hats, women in elaborate Victorian dresses, technologies that seemed magical, everything new and strange captured in traditional woodblock technique, the old medium recording its own displacement. Photography arrived, and suddenly the documentary function of prints, their role in recording famous places and beautiful faces, could be fulfilled by mechanical means. And Western printing technology, lithography, and then photomechanical reproduction offered cheaper alternatives for mass-produced images. The economic foundation of ukiyo-e began to erode. Publishers who had thrived for generations found their markets shrinking. Carvers and printers, masters of techniques that took decades to perfect, discovered their skills becoming obsolete. Some artists adapted, creating prints for export, knowing that Western collectors were developing fascination with Japanese art. These export prints sometimes emphasized exoticism, showing geisha and samurai in ways that matched Western fantasies rather than Japanese realities, and they used brighter colors, more saturated pigments, because Western audiences expected boldness, lacking the subtle appreciation for muted tones that Japanese connoisseurs valued. The medium began splitting. Prints made for domestic audiences following different aesthetics than those made for foreign markets. The traditional publisher system weakened. Some artists began self-publishing, controlling their own production, while others worked directly with Western dealers, bypassing Japanese intermediaries entirely, and the collaborative process that had been ukiyo-e's strength became harder to maintain. Master carvers retired without apprentices to replace them. Printers closed their workshops. The accumulated knowledge of centuries began to scatter, preserved only in the blocks and prints themselves, physical records of techniques that were no longer being practiced. Yet even as commercial ukiyo-e declined, the prints themselves were beginning a different journey. They were flowing out of Japan, carried by traders and tourists, finding their way into Western collections, and there they would catalyze artistic revolutions. Impressionists and post-impressionists saw in these prints radical alternatives to Western perspective and composition, the flat planes of color, the bold outlines, the willingness to crop and fragment. Artists like Van Gogh and Monet collected ukiyo-e, studied them, incorporated their lessons into paintings that would transform European art. This influence became known as Japonism, a vogue for all things Japanese that swept through Europe and America in the late 1800s, and it created feedback loops. Western artists inspired by Japanese prints, creating works that then influenced Japanese artists who were themselves trying to modernize. Traditions crossing and recrossing the Pacific, transforming in transit, each culture seeing in the other possibilities for renewal. By the early 20th century, commercial ukiyo-e had essentially ended. The last traditional publishers closed. The great carvers and printers died, their skills largely unrecorded. But something new was emerging, the Shinhanga movement, new prints, which attempted to revive woodblock printing as fine art rather than a commercial product. Artists like Hasui Kawase created landscapes that honored Hiroshige's tradition while incorporating modern sensibilities, softer colors, more atmosphere, scenes of a Japan rapidly disappearing under industrialization, nostalgic visions of villages and temples that modernization was erasing. And alongside Shinhanga came Sosaku Hanga, creative prints, where artists rejected the collaborative model entirely. designing, carving, and printing their own works, treating woodblock as a medium for personal artistic expression rather than commercial reproduction. These prints often showed Western influence, more abstract compositions, experimental use of color, and they moved woodblock printing into conversation with international modernism, transforming a tradition that had been distinctly Japanese into something that could speak across cultures. The old blocks, those that survived, were sometimes preserved in publisher archives or temple collections. Cherry wood carved 2 or 3 centuries earlier, still holding the ghosts of images. Some could still be printed, yielding impressions that connected directly to Edo period hands. Though the paper was different now, the pigments chemically manufactured rather than ground from minerals, and these late impressions lacked something, some quality of the original that couldn't quite be recaptured, like trying to restart a conversation after decades of silence. What remains now in museums and private collections scattered across the world are these sheets of paper, some faded by light, some preserved in darkness, each one a moment crystallized, a collaboration between artist and carver and printer, between vision and skill and chance. And when I consider them, these images created through such patient accumulation, I find myself drawn not just to what they show, but to what they reveal about the nature of making itself, because there is something profound in the woodblock process, in the way it requires letting go. The artist creates a design but cannot complete it alone, must trust the carver to interpret lines, the printer to choose pressures and hues, and this surrender of control, this necessary collaboration, creates images that belong to no single hand, that emerge from conversation, from the friction and harmony of different skills meeting. And perhaps this is why the prints feel so balanced, so complete, because they contain multiple perspectives, multiple kinds of knowledge, working toward unified expression, the reversal required by the medium, the way designs must be conceived in mirror image, the way carving removes material to create presence. These inversions suggest deeper truths about how meaning emerges, through absence as much as presence, through what is withheld as much as what is shown. The empty spaces in ukiyo-e compositions aren't merely background. They're active participants, creating tension, allowing breath, giving the eye places to rest before returning to detailed passages. And the ephemeral made permanent, this paradox sits at the heart of ukiyo-e philosophy. The floating world was by definition transient, pleasures that couldn't last, beauty that would fade. Courtesans aged, actors died, cherry blossoms scattered after a week, and yet the prince froze these moments, preserved them in wood and ink, created permanence from impermanence, and in doing so revealed something about human desire, our need to hold on to what we know we cannot keep, to create records of what passes, to say this was beautiful and it mattered even though it's gone. The layers of color building toward completion mirror, layers of meaning building toward understanding, each impression adding depth, each hue contributing to an effect that none could create alone. And a viewer standing before these prints sees not just the final image, but, if they look carefully, can trace the process, can see where one color overlaps another, where registration shifted slightly, where the printer's baron created subtle variations in ink density. The work reveals its own making, wears its process as part of its beauty. There's a quality in the finest ukiyo-e that resists description, a rightness of proportion, a harmony of elements that feels inevitable, as if the composition couldn't be any other way. And yet we know from preliminary drawings and variant printings that many choices went into creating this sense of inevitability, that what feels effortless required enormous effort, and this concealment of labor, this appearance of ease, represents its own kind of mastery, the ability to make difficulty disappear into grace. The way rain is depicted as parallel lines carved with such precision that they seem to fall, or snow rendered as negative space. White flakes that exist only as absence of ink. These technical solutions become poetic statements about how we perceive weather, about the relationship between mark and meaning, about how minimal information can trigger complete recognition, the mind filling in what the hand merely suggests, completing the image through its own understanding of rain, of snow, of how light falls on water, and Mount Fuji appearing again and again from countless angles in all seasons becomes more than a mountain, becomes an anchor point, a constant in a floating world, the eternal amid the transient. And each view adds to understanding. Each perspective reveals another facet, until Fuji exists, not as a single place, but as an idea, a presence that structures the landscape, that gives meaning through its persistent visibility, its refusal to change while everything around it transforms. The courtesans, frozen in their elaborate robes, their faces showing those complex expressions Utamaro captured so well, they too transcend their immediate subject. They become meditations on performance, on the construction of beauty, on the gap between surface and depth, because these women were playing roles, constructing personas that we clients desired. And the prints show both the construction and something underneath, a weariness, perhaps, or calculation, or genuine feeling breaking through professional composure. And this complexity, this refusal to reduce subjects to simple categories, elevates bijinga beyond mere decoration into something approaching portraiture, recognition of full humanity. The blocks themselves, those that survive, carry their own poetry. Wood grain still visible, centuries of aging having darkened the cherry, and the carved surfaces show where, edges slightly rounded where hundreds or thousands of printings have rubbed ink across the same grooves. And to touch these blocks, to run fingers over carved lines that guided pigment onto paper generations ago, creates uncanny connection. The same physical object that the original printer handled, the same resistance and give, wood that remembers through its own substance the hands that worked it. Collections of prints reveal patterns, certain compositions appearing with variations, artists quoting other artists, publishers reusing successful formulas. And these repetitions aren't failures of imagination, but part of the tradition. Viewers enjoyed recognizing familiar elements. Courtesans shown from three-quarter view became a convention, allowing display of profile and front simultaneously. And within these conventions, artists found room for infinite variation. The angle of a head, the choice of background color, the particular pattern on a kimono, each decision contributing to originality within tradition, innovation that honors rather than rejects what came before. The colors themselves have changed over time, fugitive pigments fading, blues that were once vibrant, now pale, reds that once blazed, now soft, and this fading creates accidental beauty, palettes that no artist intended, but that time has curated, and early impressions preserved away from light show what was lost, those electric Prussian blues, those sharp crimson aniline dyes, and the contrast reveals how much our experience of these prints is mediated by their age. We see them through the filter of their survival. Beauty transformed by time into different beauty in quiet moments. Looking at these prints, I find myself aware of all the hands involved: the artist's hand drawing, the carver's hand cutting, the printer's hand rubbing, the collector's hand preserving, the curator's hand displaying, and my own hand holding a catalog or my eyes tracing a screen. All of us connected through these images, across centuries, across cultures, touching something that refuses to die despite every reason it should have vanished with the world that created it. And perhaps that's what remains most powerful, that these prints depicting a floating world have themselves floated free of their context. They no longer need the pleasure quarters or kabuki theaters to make sense. They've become simply beautiful, simply accomplished, simply moving in ways that transcend their original purposes. And this transformation from commercial product to fine art, from local to universal, from timely to timeless, completes their journey, fulfills something the original makers might not have imagined, but somehow prepared for, by making them well, by bringing skill and care to work that could have been merely adequate. The night deepens around these thoughts, and the prints remain in their museums and collections, waiting for eyes to find them, for minds to engage with their quiet complexity, each viewing a kind of reprinting, an impression pulled from the original across the gap of time. And the collaboration continues between long-dead makers and living viewers, between wood and paper and light and attention, creating meaning anew with each encounter, the floating world floating still, held in suspension, beautiful and transient and somehow enduring, like memory itself, like all things we try to preserve against forgetting. The images fade into darkness now, courtesans returning to their houses, actors leaving the stage, Fuji disappearing into night, waves settling back into the sea. And what remains is impression, after image, the ghost of beauty on the eye, layers of color settling into something that might be rest, the baron's circular motion slowing, coming to stillness, all the marks made, all the cuts taken, all the colors applied, and the work complete, waiting in its silence, holding its stories, patient as cherrywood, soft as mulberry paper, permanent as anything can be in this floating world, where nothing lasts and everything remains, in the space between the carved and the printed, between the intended and the achieved, where all art lives in the gentle territory of almost and enough and done. I can see the faint outline of a harbor somewhere along the edge of a vast ocean, where wooden ships rest gently against weathered docks, their masts swaying like tall reeds in an evening breeze. The year is 1764, and the world feels both impossibly large and strangely intimate, as if every decision made in distant halls might ripple across thousands of miles of dark water, reaching shores where merchants count their barrels, where customs officers shuffle through manifests by candlelight, where the very idea of sugar carries weight beyond its sweetness. There is something about this moment, this particular spring, when Parliament gathers in London, and the air in the colonies feels different somehow, charged with a kind of quiet anticipation, though perhaps no one yet knows exactly why. I find myself drawn to the docks at twilight, when the work of the day has softened into shadow, and the smell of molasses hangs thick in the humid air, mingling with salt and tar and the earthy scent of timber. These are the hours when the world reveals its textures, when commerce becomes something more than ledgers and coin, when it transforms into barrels and hogsheads, into the creak of rope and the splash of oars, into the murmured conversations of sailors who have seen islands most will never know. Sugar, molasses, rum. These words echo through the warehouses like a kind of mantra, not mystical but essential, woven into the fabric of daily existence in ways both visible and hidden. A merchant might calculate his profits. A distiller might tend his stills. A ship's captain might plot his course through Caribbean waters, and each of them moves within an invisible architecture of laws and customs, of regulations written by men who have never felt tropical rain or tasted the raw bite of fresh-cut cane. The Sugar Act, though that name will come to feel almost too simple for what it represents, arrives not with thunder but with the quiet authority of official documents, sealed and stamped and carried across an ocean. Its formal title stretches longer. The American Revenue Act, words that promise order and structure, that speak of His Majesty's treasury and the proper administration of trade. But beneath the formality lies something more complicated, a reshaping of relationships, an attempt to turn what had been loose and flexible into something firm and enforceable. I watch the lamplighters make their rounds as daylight fades to that deep blue that comes just before true darkness, and I think about how laws are like light, creating boundaries between what is seen and what remains in shadow, between what is permitted and what becomes suddenly forbidden, between one way of living and another that has not yet fully taken shape. The colonies themselves feel like a collection of separate worlds, connected by coastline and commerce, but distinct in character. Boston with its tight streets and fervent debates, New York with its polyglot bustle, Philadelphia with its orderly ambition, Charleston with its rice and indigo, Newport with its merchant princes, each city a universe unto itself, each harbor a gateway to elsewhere, and through them all flows the sweet dark current of sugar trade, legal and otherwise, sanctioned and smuggled, recorded and invisible. Before this act, there had been another, the Molasses Act of 1733, which had imposed duties so high they might have strangled trade entirely, except that enforcement had been gentle, one might say, or perhaps simply negligent. The gap between law and practice had grown so wide that an entire economy had flourished in the space between. Ships had sailed, molasses had flowed, distilleries had prospered, and the royal customs officials had collected far less than the regulations suggested they should. Now, in this spring of 1764, Kuchi, something shifts. The war with France has ended. That great conflict that stretched across continents and consumed vast sums, leaving Britain victorious but deeply in debt. The territories are larger now, the responsibilities multiplied, and somewhere in the halls of power, men calculate what it costs to maintain an empire, to station troops, to administer vast new lands, to patrol seas and enforce sovereignty, and so they turn their attention to the colonies, to these prosperous ports and growing cities, to the merchants who have grown wealthy on trade, and they see perhaps an untapped source of revenue, a way to make the colonies contribute more substantially to their own defense, to the grand imperial project of which they are a part. The act itself, when it arrives, is a curious thing. It actually lowers the duty on foreign molasses from 6 pence per gallon to 3 pence, which might seem generous, except that the old rate was rarely enforced, while this new rate will be collected with vigor, with new courts and new officers, and new ships patrolling the coastlines, the mathematics of empire, calculating that a lower tax rigorously enforced will yield more revenue than a higher tax casually ignored. I stand at the water's edge, watching the tide come in, slow and inexorable, and I sense that something similar is happening in the realm of policy, a slow rising of authority, a gradual assertion of control, not dramatic, not sudden, but patient and methodical, like water finding its level. The roots of this moment stretch back further than 1764, back through decades of navigation acts and trade regulations, back to the very founding of the colonies themselves, when England first began to imagine what it meant to govern territories across an ocean, to shape their commerce, to channel their wealth toward the mother country. In 1651, Parliament had passed the first Navigation Act, establishing a principle that would echo through the generations, that colonial trade existed not for its own sake, but as an instrument of English prosperity. The act required that goods moving between England and its colonies travel only on English ships, crewed primarily by English sailors, creating a protected maritime world where Dutch and French vessels found themselves suddenly excluded from profits they had long enjoyed. These early laws carried a certain logic, born of mercantilism, that economic philosophy which viewed trade as a kind of contest, where one nation's gain meant another's loss, where the accumulation of gold and silver measured power, and where colonies existed primarily to enrich the realm that claimed them. Under this view, the American colonies should provide raw materials England needed, purchase manufactured goods England produced, and, above all, conduct their commerce in ways that strengthened English shipping and filled English coffers. The system grew more elaborate over time, layer upon layer of regulation. The Navigation Act of 1660 expanded the list of enumerated goods, those products that could be shipped only to England or other English colonies, never directly to foreign ports. Sugar appeared on this list, along with tobacco and cotton and indigo, each commodity bound by invisible chains to English docks, required to pass through English hands before reaching the wider world. For the sugar islands of the Caribbean, this created a kind of golden captivity. Barbados, Jamaica, the Leeward Islands. These places produced sugar in quantities that astonished European markets. Their plantations stretched across hillsides, worked by enslaved people torn from Africa, creating wealth on a scale that seemed almost fantastic. The white crystalline substance that emerged from their mills and boiling houses commanded high prices, and under the Navigation Acts, all of it flowed toward England, enriching merchants and factors, generating customs revenues, feeding refineries in London and Bristol. But the northern colonies, places like Massachusetts and Rhode Island and New York, found themselves in a different position. They produced fewer goods that England desperately wanted. Their timber and fish and grain served useful purposes, but did not generate the spectacular profits of sugar or tobacco. Yet they too needed to purchase English manufactured goods, needed to participate in the commercial empire, needed to find some way to balance their accounts. And here, in this asymmetry, emerged the molasses trade, a circulation of goods that would define the northern colonial economy. The sugar islands produced molasses as a byproduct, that thick dark syrup left behind when sugar crystals formed. In the islands themselves, molasses held limited value. The planters focused on sugar, on that refined white product that fetched premium prices, and the molasses accumulated, barrels and barrels of it, looking for markets. The northern colonies discovered they could purchase this molasses cheaply, particularly from the French islands, Martinique and Guadeloupe, where French planters cared even less about the byproduct than their English counterparts. The French focused almost exclusively on sugar for European markets, and sold their molasses at prices far below what English islands charged. Colonial merchants sent their ships south, riding the winds and currents down the Atlantic coast, carrying timber and dried fish and provisions, goods the sugar islands needed to sustain their operations. These ships would return laden with molasses, which flowed into the distilleries that multiplied along the northern coast. In these establishments, the molasses underwent transformation, heating in copper stills, emerging as rum, clear or dark, harsh or smooth, so a spirit that found ready markets everywhere. This rum served many purposes. Colonists drank it themselves naturally and in taverns and home, at celebrations and gatherings, but it also became a medium of exchange. Traders carried rum to Africa, where it formed part of the terrible commerce in human beings, purchasing enslaved people who would be transported to the plantations, completing a triangle of trade that bound 3 continents in relationships of exploitation and profit. The rum also went to Newfoundland, where fishing fleets needed provisions. It went to the wine islands, Madeira and the Canaries, in exchange for wines that colonial merchants could then sell in England. It even went to the sugar islands themselves, where planters and overseers and sailors all desired spirits, creating a curious circular trade where molasses left the islands, became rum in colonial distilleries, and returned as a finished product. This entire system operated somewhat outside the formal imperial framework, or perhaps alongside it. The Navigation Acts had not anticipated how central sell molasses would become to northern colonial prosperity, had not imagined the distilleries that would multiply, the ships that would sail, the web of trade routes that would develop. And when Parliament finally recognized that vast quantities of French molasses were enriching colonial merchants while bypassing English customs, they moved to assert control. The Molasses Act of 1733 emerged from pressure by the English sugar islands. The planters there, seeing colonial merchants purchase French molasses, complained bitterly that this trade undermined their own interests. If the northern colonies would only buy English molasses, even at higher prices, the sugar islands would profit more. The act therefore imposed a duty of 6 pence per gallon on foreign molasses, along with substantial duties on foreign sugar and rum, rates calculated to make French products prohibitively expensive, to force colonial merchants back toward English suppliers. But enforcement proved difficult, perhaps impossible. The American coastline stretched for hundreds of miles, punctuated by countless harbors and inlets and rivers. Customs officials were few, often corrupt, sometimes sympathetic to local merchants. The very geography of the colonies worked against tight control. A ship might anchor in a quiet cove, transfer its cargo to smaller boats, land the molasses miles from any customs house, and by the time officials learned of the cargo, it had already disappeared into warehouses and distilleries. Moreover, colonial merchants developed sophisticated methods of evasion. They kept double sets of books, declared only a portion of their cargo, paid bribes to friendly officials, obtained blank customs documents they could fill in as needed. The line between legal commerce and smuggling blurred until it nearly vanished. What the law called illegal, the merchants called simply business, a practical response to regulations they viewed as unjust and economically ruinous. And so for 3 decades, the Molasses Act remained largely a fiction, a law on paper that generated minimal revenue. Colonial distilleries continued to flourish. Ships continued to sail to French islands. The northern colonial economy hummed along, producing rum, building ships, developing a merchant class of increasing wealth and confidence. And in London, Parliament noticed this prosperity, noticed that their own regulations generated far less customs revenue than expected, noticed the gap between theory and practice. The 7 Years' War changed everything. That global conflict, called the French and Indian War in the colonies, raged from 1756 to 1763, consuming resources on an unprecedented scale. Britain and France fought across multiple continents, in Europe and India and the Caribbean and the forests of North America. The war required massive expenditures for troops and ships and supplies, for subsidies to allies, for the entire machinery of 18th century warfare. Britain emerged victorious. France ceded Canada and territories east of the Mississippi. Spain surrendered Florida. The British Empire reached its greatest territorial extent yet, but victory came at an enormous cost. The national debt had nearly doubled, reaching a sum that alarmed even the most optimistic ministers. And now this enlarged empire required administration, required troops to garrison frontiers posts, required naval squadrons to patrol expanded waters, required officials to govern new territories, all of which demanded ongoing expenditure. George Grenville, who became prime minister in 1763, surveyed this situation with the eye of a man who prided himself on fiscal prudence. He saw an empire deep in debt. He saw colonies that had benefited from British military protection, and he saw revenue collection systems that leaked money at every turn. The American colonies, prosperous and growing, contributed relatively little to imperial expenses. Their customs revenues barely covered the costs of collection, while smuggling remained endemic. Grenville determined to address this situation, to make the empire pay for itself, to extract from the colonies a fairer share of the costs of their own defense and administration. The Sugar Act, formally introduced in March of 1764, represented his first major attempt at reform, not a revolutionary change, not a dramatic break with the past, but rather an effort to make existing systems actually work, to transform paper regulations into enforced reality. The Act's preamble spoke of raising revenue openly and directly. Previous navigation acts had focused on regulating trade, on channeling commerce in preferred directions. This act explicitly stated that its purpose was to generate income for the Crown, to help offset the costs of defending and securing the American territories. The language itself marked a shift from regulation to taxation, from commercial policy to revenue extraction. The details of the act itself revealed the thinking of men who believed administration could solve what leniency had allowed to flourish. The duty on foreign molasses dropped from 6 pence to 3 pence per gallon, a reduction that seemed generous on its surface, but accompanied by provisions that transformed the entire enforcement apparatus. New vice admiralty courts would try smuggling cases without juries, placing judgment in the hands of royally appointed judges rather than sympathetic local citizens. The burden of proof shifted, requiring accused merchants to demonstrate their innocence rather than forcing the Crown to prove guilt. Additional items joined the list of enumerated goods. Coffee and pimiento and certain types of wine now fell under tighter regulation. Iron and lumber faced new restrictions. The act even addressed wine from Madeira, that Portuguese archipelago whose sweet fortified vintages had long been a profitable item of colonial trade. Now such wine could only enter the colonies through England, adding time and expense and the involvement of English middlemen to what had been direct commerce, but perhaps most significantly, the Act funded expanded enforcement. It allocated money for more customs officers, more ships to patrol the coast, more officials to inspect warehouses and docks. The Royal Navy received instructions to assist in customs enforcement. Warships that had fought the French now turned their attention to colonial merchants, their captains authorized to stop and search vessels, to seize suspicious cargo, to deliver accused smugglers to the new courts. I imagine standing in a customs house as these changes take effect, watching officers sort through new regulations, their fingers tracing down pages of instructions. The paperwork multiplies. Every shipment now requires more detailed documentation, certificates of origin, sworn statements about cargo contents, bonds posted to guarantee compliance, the casual arrangements of the past, the nod and wink, the looking the other way. These informal accommodations become suddenly dangerous for both merchants and officials. A ship arrives at Boston Harbor, its hold filled with molasses from Martinique. The captain had made this voyage a dozen times before, knew the usual procedures, the expected fees, both official and unofficial, but now he finds himself facing a different reality. Officers board his vessel and conduct a thorough inspection, comparing his manifest against the actual cargo, measuring the hogsheads, taking samples. The process takes hours, then days, while his molasses sits in the hold, and he calculates the mounting costs of delay. They find discrepancies. Of course they do. The manifest declares one quantity. The inspection reveals another. Perhaps the captain had hoped to land some portion quietly to avoid duty on the full amount. Perhaps he had obtained his paperwork from a friendly official who understood the traditional flexibility. But now these small evasions carry real consequences. His cargo faces seizure. He faces prosecution in Vice Admiralty Court, without a jury of fellow merchants who might sympathize, without the protection that local sentiment might provide. The news spreads through the merchant community like wind across water. Stories circulate in coffee houses and taverns of ships detained, of cargo confiscated, of trials that seem designed to produce convictions. The old certainties dissolve. The calculations that had governed trade for decades no longer apply. A merchant who had planned his ventures assuming minimal enforcement now confronts a system that actually collects what the law demands, and the mathematics prove brutal. A gallon of French molasses might cost 4 pence. Adding 3 pence in duty raises the cost to 7 pence. English molasses from the Sugar Islands might cost 8 pence or 9 pence. The gap narrows, but does not close. French molasses remains cheaper, yet not so cheap that the risk of seizure makes smuggling worthwhile. The act achieves exactly what Grenville intended, making legal trade more attractive than illegal, not through prohibition, but through calculation, through making the honest payment of duties the rational economic choice. The distillers feel the pressure most acutely. Their businesses depended on cheap molasses, on the abundance that French islands provided. Their stills had been designed for continuous operation, consuming molasses in quantities that required the lowest possible prices. Now they face a choice: pay the higher duties and reduce their profits, or raise the price of rum and risk losing customers, or reduce production and leave their stills idle. Some distillers attempt to pass the costs forward. Rum prices creep upward. Tavern keepers grumble. Consumers notice. The spirit that had been affordable to common sailors and laborers becomes a luxury, or at least less accessible. The ripple effects spread outward. Ships that had carried rum to Africa find their cargoes less competitive. Traders who had exchanged rum for other goods discover their medium of exchange has lost value. Others seek alternative suppliers, perhaps English molasses, despite the higher cost, at least avoiding the duty and the risk. But the English islands cannot produce enough. Their plantations focus on sugar, and their molasses output falls short of colonial demand. Scarcity develops. Prices rise further. The entire careful balance of the triangular trade begins to shift and buckle in the royal customs houses. The new regime brings its own complications. Officers who had grown accustomed to the old casual system now face pressure to perform, to demonstrate results, to justify the expanded enforcement apparatus. They receive instructions to be vigilant, to suspect every shipment, to assume evasion rather than honesty. The relationship between customs officials and merchants, never warm, becomes actively antagonistic. Some officers embrace their new authority with zeal. They see themselves as servants of the crown, enforcing rightful laws against men who had grown too comfortable with violation. They board ships at all hours, demand to see every document, question every declaration. Their diligence generates seizures and prosecutions, but also delays and disruptions. Legitimate merchants find their operations hampered by inspections that assume guilt. Other officers, perhaps more sympathetic to local concerns, or simply more pragmatic, find themselves caught between instructions from London and the reality of colonial ports. They know the merchants, understand the traditional practices, recognize that overzealous enforcement might strangle trade entirely. Yet they also know that failure to collect adequate revenue will mark them as incompetent or corrupt. They navigate a narrow path, trying to enforce enough to satisfy their superiors while not alienating the community entirely. The Vice Admiralty courts begin their work. These institutions, sitting without juries, operating under Admiralty law rather than common law, become theaters of resentment. A merchant accused of smuggling stands before a judge appointed by the crown. The judge has incentives to convict, sharing in the value of seized goods. The merchant cannot appeal to local sympathies, cannot hope that his neighbors will nullify an unjust law through their verdict. He can only present his case and await judgment. The verdicts tend toward conviction. Ships and cargo disappear into royal possession, sold at auction, the proceeds divided among the crown, the informer, the judge, a system designed to be self-funding through the very violations it prosecutes, creating perverse incentives where officials profit from finding guilt, where every ship becomes a potential prize, where the machinery of justice transforms into an engine of revenue extraction. Colonial newspapers begin to take notice. Printers in Boston and New York and Philadelphia publish accounts of seized ships, of trials that seem predetermined, of merchants ruined by what they view as excessive enforcement of unjust laws. The articles adopt tones ranging from measured concern to outright indignation. They question whether Parliament has the right to tax the colonies for revenue, whether the traditional British liberty of trial by jury can be suspended, whether these policies serve the empire's true interests. Some writers invoke principles. They speak of rights as Englishmen, of constitutional limitations on parliamentary power, of the distinction between external taxes that regulate trade and internal taxes that raise revenue. The Sugar Act, they argue, crosses a line. It abandons the pretense of commercial regulation and explicitly seeks to extract money from the colonies without their consent. Without representation in Parliament, they cannot be justly taxed. The phrase begins to circulate, appearing in pamphlets and letters, in speeches and sermons. Taxation without representation, a principle that will echo far beyond this moment. Others focus on practical consequences. They calculate the economic damage, ships sitting idle because merchants cannot afford the duties, distilleries closing because rum no longer turns a profit, sailors unemployed because trade has contracted. The argument runs that Britain benefits from colonial prosperity, that a thriving colonial economy purchases more British manufactured goods, generates more shipping for British vessels, contributes more to imperial wealth than any customs revenue might provide. The Sugar Act, in seeking to extract a few £1,000s in duties, risks damaging a commercial relationship worth hundreds of thousands. In London, Grenville and his supporters view these complaints with limited sympathy. The colonies, they observe, enjoyed British military protection during the recent war. British troops fought and died to secure their frontiers. British ships patrolled their coasts. British taxpayers funded expeditions that expanded colonial territories. Now, with the war won and the debt mounting, the colonies balk at contributing even a modest share toward the costs of their own defense and administration. The revenue projections seemed reasonable. The colonies imported vast quantities of molasses. If even half of it paid the threepence duty, the annual revenue might reach £40,000 or £50,000. Not enough to erase the deficit, but a meaningful contribution. And if enforcement worked as intended, if smuggling declined and compliance increased, the amount might grow. Meanwhile, the principle would be established that Parliament could legislate for the colonies, could impose taxes for revenue, could expect obedience to its will, but the actual collections fall short of expectations. Merchants prove adaptable, finding new ways to minimize their tax burden. They import less molasses overall, accepting reduced production rather than higher costs. They shift to alternative sources, seeking out Portuguese or Spanish islands where enforcement remains lax. They continue to smuggle, though more carefully, accepting greater risk in exchange for lower prices. The Vice Admiralty courts secure convictions, but cannot catch every violation, cannot inspect every cargo, cannot seal every inlet where a small boat might land molasses in the dark. The summer of 1764 brings a peculiar tension to the colonial ports. The act has been in force for several months now, long enough for its effects to become visible, but not so long that anyone knows how the story will end. Merchants adjust their strategies, customs officers refine their methods, and beneath the surface of daily commerce, something larger stirs, a question about authority and consent that has no easy answer. In Rhode Island, that small colony whose prosperity depended heavily on the molasses trade, the impact cuts especially deep. Newport had grown rich on triangular commerce, its distilleries producing rum in prodigious quantities, its merchants operating fleets of ships that ranged from the Caribbean to Africa to Newfoundland. The town's elegant houses, its busy wharves, its sophisticated mercantile networks, all rested on foundations of cheap molasses and profitable rum. Now those foundations tremble. Distillers reduce operations, some close entirely. Unable to make the economics work under the new regime, ship owners find fewer profitable voyages available. Sailors seek work elsewhere. The ripple effects touch everyone, from the coopers who made barrels, to the chandlers who supplied ships, to the tavern keepers who served the maritime community. A town built on trade feels trade constrict, and the mood darkens accordingly. The Rhode Island Assembly debates how to respond. They draft petitions to Parliament, carefully worded documents that protest the act while affirming loyalty to the Crown. They argue economic necessity, pointing out that the northern colonies lack gold and silver, that they depend on trade to generate the currency needed to purchase British goods, that restrictions on that trade undermine the very commercial relationship that benefits Britain. The petitions speak of rights, but frame them in terms of mutual interest rather than confrontation. Massachusetts takes a more assertive stance. Samuel Adams, a Boston merchant and political organizer, begins to articulate arguments that question Parliament's authority more directly. He writes under various pseudonyms, his articles appearing in the Boston Gazette, suggesting that the colonies possess rights that even Parliament cannot violate, that taxation requires consent, that representation cannot be virtual or theoretical, but must be actual and direct. These ideas find receptive audiences, particularly among merchants who feel the Sugar Act's bite, but also among lawyers and ministers and educated colonists who follow political theory. They discuss Locke and Montesquieu, debate the nature of the British Constitution, ask whether the relationship between Britain and the colonies resembles that between Parliament and English counties, or whether the colonies occupy some different status, something more autonomous, more akin to separate realms sharing a monarch. The debates remain mostly theoretical at this stage, argued in newspaper columns and tavern conversations, not yet translated into organized resistance. Most colonists still view themselves as British subjects, proud of the empire, grateful for its protection, hoping that reasonable argument might persuade Parliament to reconsider. that Grenville might recognize the policy's flaws and adjust accordingly. The possibility of fundamental rupture seems remote, almost unthinkable. Meanwhile, in the Caribbean, the Sugar Islands watched these developments with mixed feelings. The planters there had lobbied for the Molasses Act decades earlier, had complained about colonial merchants buying French molasses. Yet they too operate within the imperial system. They too know the weight of regulation. And some among them wonder whether stricter enforcement might eventually affect their own interests, whether the principle of parliamentary taxation, once established, might expand in unexpected directions. The fall brings the first test of organized colonial response. The Massachusetts Assembly proposes a joint meeting of colonial representatives, a Congress to coordinate petitions and present a unified voice to Parliament. The idea gains traction slowly. Some colonies enthusiastically support it. Others hesitate, worried about appearing too unified, too organized, too much like a separate political entity rather than individual provinces of the Crown. The Stamp Act looms on the horizon, though few yet know its shape. Grenville continues to search for revenue. The Sugar Act has proven disappointing in its collections, generating far less than projected. He begins to contemplate more direct forms of taxation, duties that cannot be evaded through smuggling, that touch every colonist regardless of their involvement in maritime trade. But that belongs to the next year, to 1765, when the nature of a colonial discontent will transform from merchant complaints into something broader and more volatile. For now, in late 1764, the Sugar Act remains the focus. The customs houses continue their work. The Vice Admiralty courts hear their cases. Merchants adapt and maneuver. Some find the new system tolerable, even profitable if they can undercut competitors who still attempt to smuggle. Others sink into bankruptcy, victims of changing rules and vigorous enforcement. The colonial economy adjusts, contracts in some areas, finds new channels in others, demonstrates the resilience of commercial networks under pressure. The enforcement itself proves costly. The expanded customs service requires salaries. The naval patrols consume resources. The Vice Admiralty courts need judges and clerks and facilities. When the accountants in London tally the costs against the revenues, the balance looks less impressive than Grenville had hoped. The net gain barely justifies the effort, and certainly falls far short of making a significant dent in the imperial debt. But the Act's significance extends beyond the pounds and shillings it collects. It establishes precedents. It demonstrates that Parliament will legislate for the colonies, will enforce those laws, will resist local opposition. It tests colonial responses, revealing which arguments gain traction, which forms of resistance emerge, how unified the colonies might become when facing a common grievance. In this sense, the Sugar Act serves as a rehearsal, a preliminary act in a much longer drama. Some historians will later argue that the act itself was reasonable, that 3 pence per gallon on molasses represented a modest duty, that the colonies could well afford to contribute something toward imperial expenses, that Grenville's logic was sound even if his execution proved flawed. They will point out that the act reduced the official tax rate, that it aimed at enforcement rather than confiscation, that it sought order rather than oppression. Others will see in the act the seeds of revolution, not because of its specific provisions, but because of the principles it embodied. The explicit statement that Parliament could tax for revenue, the use of vice admiralty courts without juries, the assumption that colonial interests should yield to imperial needs, the willingness to damage colonial economies in pursuit of modest gains. These elements, they argue, revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of the colonial relationship, a failure to recognize that distance and self-governance had created societies that could not be managed like English counties. Both interpretations contain truth. The act was both reasonable and provocative, both modest and threatening, both a practical revenue measure and a constitutional assertion. The ambiguity itself created problems. If Parliament had declared openly that it possessed unlimited authority to tax the colonies, the confrontation might have come sooner, but perhaps more cleanly. If instead Parliament had sought colonial approval through their own assemblies, the revenue might have come voluntarily, but the middle path, asserting authority while calling it reasonable, demanding compliance while expecting gratitude, this approach satisfied neither imperial needs nor colonial sensibilities. Through the winter of 1764 into 1765, the machinery of the Sugar Act continues to operate. Ships come and go, duties are paid or evaded, courts convict or acquit. The daily rhythm of enforcement becomes routine, almost mundane. Yet beneath this surface normalcy, attitudes shift. Merchants who pay duties resent them. Those who refuse and face prosecution grow bitter. Colonists who never traded in molasses begin to pay attention, wondering if today's customs duties might become tomorrow's land taxes or poll taxes or taxes on documents. The conversations in colonial taverns and coffee houses take on new dimensions. Where once men debated shipping routes and market prices, now they discuss constitutional theory, natural rights, the limits of parliamentary sovereignty. Books and pamphlets circulate, Locke's treatises on government, Montesquieu's analysis of liberty, English opposition writers who had critiqued the growth of executive power. These texts, written in different times for different purposes, find new relevance in colonial contexts, become ammunition in arguments about authority and freedom. Colonial lawyers prove particularly engaged. Men trained in English common law who see in the vice admiralty courts a violation of traditional protections, James Otis in Massachusetts, John Dickinson in Pennsylvania, Patrick Henry in Virginia. These and others begin to craft legal arguments against parliamentary taxation, not as revolution, not yet, but as defense of what they understand to be their rights as Englishmen. Their rhetoric combines conservative appeals to tradition with innovative claims about colonial status. They argue simultaneously that they deserve the same rights as Englishmen in Britain, and that their distance and circumstances create special considerations that Parliament must respect. The colonial assemblies, those elected bodies that had long managed local affairs, find themselves in an awkward position. They possess real power within their colonies. They vote taxes, appropriate funds, pass local legislation, but they also exist at Parliament's sufferance. Their authority derives from royal charters that Parliament could theoretically revoke. They want to assert colonial rights without appearing to claim independence, to resist what they view as unconstitutional taxation without rejecting parliamentary sovereignty entirely. The logical contradictions in this position will eventually become untenable. But for now, in 1765, they attempt to navigate the narrow space between submission and rebellion. The Sugar Act itself will remain in force for years, modified occasionally, its rates adjusted, its provisions refined, but its real importance lies not in its longevity, but in its timing. It arrived at a moment when the colonies had grown wealthy enough to resent taxation, confident enough to question authority, connected enough to coordinate responses. Had it come earlier, when the colonies were smaller and more dependent, the reaction might have been muted. Had it come later, after other provocations had already mobilized opposition, it might have been lost in larger conflicts. But coming when it did, in 1764, it served as catalyst, transforming latent concerns into active grievances, turning theoretical debates into practical resistance. I watched the sun set over a colonial harbor, the water turning gold, and then crimson, and then deep purple, the ships at anchor rock gently, their masts dark lines against the fading light. Tomorrow they will sail, carrying their cargoes through a world of regulations and duties, of courts and customs houses, of laws made across an ocean by men who have never stood on these docks, never felt the particular quality of this air, never understood in their bones what it means to live at this distance, in this emerging society, poised between old identities and new possibilities. The Sugar Act exists now as something more than legislation. It has become a mirror in which the colonies begin to see themselves differently, not as scattered provinces on the edge of empire, but as societies with their own rhythms and reasons, their own sense of what justice requires, their own understanding of the relationship between power and consent. There is something almost inevitable about what unfolds, not in the sense that revolution was predetermined, but in the way that certain questions, once asked, demand answers that cannot be deferred forever. When Parliament asserts the right to tax for revenue, when it stations ships to enforce compliance, when it establishes courts that bypass local juries, it forces colonists to consider what they believe about authority, about representation, about the sources of legitimate government. These are not simple questions. They carry philosophical weight that extends beyond molasses and rum, beyond customs duties and admiralty courts. They touch the fundamental problem of how people separated by an ocean can maintain a shared political identity, whether distance itself creates new forms of sovereignty, whether the act of building communities in a new world transforms the rights and obligations of those who do the building. I think of the distiller tending his still, watching the clear liquid drip from the cooling coil. He performs this work because it brings profit, because there is demand for what he produces, because he has invested in equipment and reputation and expects to earn a living from his skill. The Sugar Act changes his calculations, forces him to decide whether to pay duties that cut his margins or to risk smuggling and face the consequences. But beyond these immediate choices, he must also consider what it means that men in London, men he has never met and who have never seen his distillery, can reshape his livelihood with a stroke of a pen. The question generalizes: if Parliament can tax molasses, can it tax anything? Can it impose levies on land, on inheritances, on newspapers, on the documents that record daily transactions? The Stamp Act will soon provide that answer. Yes, Parliament believes it can tax all these things, and the colonists will respond with a vehemence that surprises everyone, including themselves. discovering in their resistance a unity they had not known they possessed. But here, in the aftermath of the Sugar Act, the resistance remains fragmented, uncertain of its own limits. Colonial assemblies petition respectfully. Merchants grumble, but mostly comply. Lawyers craft arguments they hope will persuade rather than provoke. The possibility of reconciliation still exists. The breach still seems repairable. If only Parliament will listen, if only the king will intervene, if only reasonable men on both sides can find accommodation, this hope, this faith in the possibility of mutual understanding reflects a deep loyalty to Britain and British institutions. The colonists think of themselves as British. They take pride in British liberties, in the glorious revolution that limited royal power, in the traditions of common law and parliamentary government. They want these traditions extended to them, not abandoned. They seek inclusion, not separation, at least for now, at least in 1764 and 65, when the future remains unwritten and many paths still seem possible. The Sugar Act also reveals something about the nature of empire itself, about the tensions inherent in governing distant territories. The empire had grown through a kind of benign neglect, allowing the colonies substantial autonomy in their internal affairs, intervening mainly to regulate external trade and ensure strategic loyalty. This arrangement worked because it demanded little, asked mainly that the colonies not trade with Britain's enemies, not establish manufactures that competed with British industry, not threaten imperial interests. But the 7 Years' War changed the calculus. The expanded empire required more active governance. The enormous debt demanded new revenue sources. The policy of salutary neglect, of overlooking violations and allowing local flexibility, gave way to a vision of empire as an integrated system, efficiently administered, properly taxed, uniformly regulated. The Sugar Act embodied this new vision, this belief that rational policy and vigorous enforcement could transform colonial relationships. What the architects of this policy failed to grasp or chose to ignore was that decades of autonomy had created expectations, habits of self-governance that could not easily be undone. The colonial assemblies had grown accustomed to managing their own affairs. Colonial merchants had built their businesses on assumptions of minimal interference. Colonial societies had developed their own characters, their own ways of understanding rights and obligations. To suddenly impose tighter control, to dismiss local concerns as mere inconvenience, this was to misread fundamentally the societies that had emerged in the American wilderness. And so the Sugar Act becomes a beginning, not of revolution, not yet, but of a conversation about power that will grow increasingly difficult, increasingly fraught, until conversation itself becomes impossible and other forms of expression take its place. The path from threepence duty on molasses to independence and war stretches across 12 years, involves many other acts and events, encompasses boycotts and tea parties, massacres and congresses, declarations and battles. But the seeds exist here in the summer and fall of 1764, when merchants first confront the reality of enforced taxation, when assemblies first draft their careful protests, when colonists first articulate the principle that taxation requires representation. These are the opening moves in a game whose rules both sides believe they understand, but whose outcome will surprise everyone, transforming subjects into citizens, provinces into states, an empire into something new and unprecedented. The harbor grows quiet as evening deepens. The last ships of the day have secured their moorings. The customs house has closed its doors. The distilleries bank their fires for the night. In the gathering darkness, the world of the Sugar Act seems almost peaceful. Just commerce and regulation, duties paid and recorded, the ordinary machinery of imperial administration turning steadily, but beneath the surface, in conversations not yet finished, in letters being drafted, in arguments taking shape in minds that will not rest. Something else is happening. A question is being posed about consent and authority, about distance and identity, about the rights of people to shape the governments under which they live. The answer to that question will not come quickly, will not come easily, will cost more than anyone in 1764 can imagine. For now, the molasses flows, or doesn't. The duties are paid or evaded. The courts render their judgments. The ships sail on, carrying their cargoes through a world that seems solid, but is already beginning to shift, already moving toward transformations that will reshape not just the British Empire, but the very idea of what government can be, what rights mean, what consent requires. I stand at the water's edge as the stars emerge, one by one, pricking the darkening sky with light, the same stars that shine on London, on the Sugar Islands, on the coast of Africa, on ships at sea. They mark a world connected by commerce and empire, by winds and currents, by the invisible lines of authority that claim to bind scattered territories into a single realm. But they also mark distances, the vast gulf between the Thames and the Charles River, between the halls of Parliament and the coffee houses of Boston, between those who make laws and those who must live under them. And in that distance, in that separation of experience and understanding, lies the space where the future will unfold, where new ideas will take root, where the certainties of empire will give way to the experiments of republic. The night settles fully now. The harbor holds its ships in gentle darkness. Tomorrow they will sail, carrying their cargoes toward destinations known and unknown, moving through a world of regulations that seek to order their passage, to extract revenue from their commerce, to bind them to purposes they may not share. But tonight, in this quiet moment between day and night, between one era and another, they simply rest, rocking gently on the tide, waiting for the dawn, waiting for whatever comes next. The water laps against the pilings, a soft rhythmic sound that has marked these shores long before the first European ships arrived, and will continue long after the empire's rise and fall. It speaks of continuity beneath change, of the persistence of the physical world, even as the human arrangements built upon it transform and dissolve. The Sugar Act, Parliament, the British Empire itself, these are all temporary structures, attempts to impose order on the flowing chaos of human affairs. They will have their moment, their influence, their consequences, and then pass into history, Gukel's becoming stories we tell about how the present came to be. And in the telling, in the slow recitation of what happened and why, in the gentle exploration of these old conflicts and transformations, there is a kind of peace. The urgency has drained away. The passions have cooled. What remains is simply the shape of events, the pattern of cause and effect, the slow unfolding of decisions made by people who could not see their ultimate consequences, who did what seemed reasonable at the time, and set in motion currents that carried everyone, willing or not, toward shores they had not intended to reach. The darkness completes itself, stars and water, silence and distance. The story of the sugar act dissolves into the larger story of which it forms a part. And that story, too, dissolves into the even larger story of how people organize themselves, how they contest authority, how they discover what they believe only when forced to choose. And all of it flows together, past and present, cause and consequence, until the distinctions blur and there is only the gentle rhythm of time passing, of events receding into memory, of history becoming the quiet voice that speaks across the years, whispering of molasses and duties, of ships and courts, of an empire that believed it could hold an ocean in its grasp, and found instead that the ocean, patient and persistent, would always slip away. There is a certain kind of silence that exists in a room where something is thinking, not a living creature, but a machine, humming softly in the corner of a laboratory, a presence made of circuits and light, and in that silence there is a story that stretches back through decades, through centuries of human dreaming. A story of how we learned to build Buddha minds from metal and glass, how we taught sand to remember, and how the world changed quietly, persistently, one calculation at a time. I find myself drawn tonight to this story, to the gentle unfolding of an idea that began long before the first computer ever switched on, back when computation meant something entirely different, when it meant a person sitting at a desk, working through columns of numbers with a pencil, their hand moving steadily across the page, carrying remainders, checking sums, the scratch of graphite on paper the only sound in rooms where the future was being calculated by hand. The story doesn't begin with a sudden flash of invention, but rather with a slow accumulation, like sediment settling at the bottom of a river, layer upon layer of human ingenuity, each generation adding something to what came before, building toward a threshold they couldn't quite see yet, though some of them sensed it, dreamed of it, wrote about it in letters and journals that survive to this day. Picture the world in the 1800s, when mathematicians like Charles Babbage sat in their studies, contemplating engines made of brass and iron, machines with thousands of moving parts, gears that would mesh and turn, carrying mechanical memory from one operation to the next, his analytical engine never fully built in his lifetime, but alive in detailed drawings, in the careful notations of Ada Lovelace, who saw in those theoretical gears something more than mere calculation, who glimpsed the possibility that such a machine might one day manipulate symbols, create patterns, perhaps even compose music, the quiet patience required to imagine such things, to design mechanisms that wouldn't be built for another century. There is something deeply peaceful about that kind of forward thinking, that faith in future minds who would pick up the thread and continue the work. And they did continue it through the mechanical calculators of the late 19th century, through the punched card systems that Herman Hollerith developed, cards with patterns of rubrics of holes that could be sorted and counted by machine, used first to process the American census, transforming months of labor into weeks, the cards passing through readers, pins dropping through holes to complete circuits, a kind of binary thinking already emerging. Yes or no, whole or no hole, on or off. There's something almost meditative about imagining those cards stacked in boxes, each one encoding a piece of information, each hole punched with precision, the mechanical sorters clicking and whirring as they organized data, finding patterns in populations, in demographics, in the countless small facts that make up a society, and then, gradually, as the 20th century began to unfold, the technology started to shift, started to incorporate electrical components, relays that could open and close faster than any mechanical gear, vacuum tubes that could switch currents on and off in fractions of a second. And with these new components, the possibilities began to expand, to accelerate, though still at what would seem to us now like a glacial pace. The story gathers momentum in the years before and during the Second World War, when urgent questions demanded urgent answers, when the need to break codes, to calculate trajectories, to process vast amounts of information quickly, pushed inventors and mathematicians and engineers to think differently, to work with new urgency. And yet even in that urgency there was careful thought, deliberate design, the kind of focused attention that creates lasting change. Tonight, as I trace this story out, I can almost hear the echo of those early machine rooms, the clatter of relays switching, the warm glow of vacuum tubes lighting up panels in dim laboratories, the smell of hot electronics and machine oil, and the people who tended these machines, who programmed them with patch cables and switches, who learned to think in the binary language that the machines understood, creating a new kind of conversation between human and mechanism, between question and answer. In the 1930s and early 40s, the idea of a universal computing machine was still more philosophy than reality, still living in the realm of thought experiments and theoretical papers. Alan Turing, working at Cambridge and later at Bletchley Park, had described in 1936 what he called a universal machine, an abstract concept, a device that could read symbols on an infinite tape, process them according to a set of rules, and write new symbols back. It was mathematics, pure and theoretical, but it contained within it the seed of every computer that would ever exist. The beauty of Turing's concept was its simplicity, its reduction of all computation to basic operations. Read a symbol, change state, write a symbol, move the tape, and yet from these simple steps not infinite complexity could emerge. Any calculation that could be described algorithmically could be performed given enough time, enough tape, enough patience, but patience was something the world of the 1940s couldn't afford much of. War had come to Europe, and with it, an urgent need for machines that could break encrypted messages, that could calculate artillery tables, that could process information faster than rooms full of human computers ever could. And so the theoretical began to become practical. The abstract began to take physical form. At Bletchley Park, in the British countryside, away from the bombs falling on London, a team of mathematicians and engineers built machines to break the German Enigma code, the bomb machines, electromechanical devices that could test thousands of possible rotor settings, clicking through combinations, searching for the one arrangement that would unlock that day's messages. Turing himself worked there, applying his theoretical knowledge to very practical problems. The machines running day and night, their operators listening to the rhythm of the rotors, learning to hear when the machine had found something promising. And then came Colossus, completed in 1943 at Bletchley Park, designed by Tommy Flowers and his team, the first programmable electronic digital computer using vacuum tubes instead of mechanical relays, processing the encrypted German high command messages, the Lorenz cipher, far more complex than Enigma. Colossus used over 2,000 vacuum tubes, reading paper tape at high speed, 5,000 characters per second, a speed that seemed almost magical at the time. The room where Colossus operated was kept secret for decades after the war. The machine itself was largely destroyed, its existence classified, but it represented a threshold crossed, the proof that electronic components could be arranged to perform logical operations, that light could flow through circuits faster than thought, that electricity itself could be made to think in its own binary way. Across the Atlantic, parallel developments were unfolding at the University of Pennsylvania in a former fraternity house. Work began in 1943 on a machine called ENIAC, the Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer, commissioned by the United States Army to calculate artillery firing tables, the trajectories of shells, the countless variables of wind and weather and angle that determined where a projectile would land. ENIAC was enormous, occupying a room 40 feet by 80 feet, weighing 30 tons, containing 17,000 vacuum tubes, 7,000 crystal diodes, 10,000 capacitors, 70,000 resistors, 5 million hand-soldered joints. It consumed 150 kilowatts of power, enough to dim the lights in the neighborhood when it was switched on. The heat from all those vacuum tubes made the room unbearably warm, fans running constantly to prevent the components from burning out. Programming ENIAC was an elaborate physical process. Engineers, many of them women who had worked as human computers during the war, would set switches and plug in cables, physically routing the flow of electricity through different pathways to create different calculations. It could take days to set up a new problem, but once configured, ENIAC could perform calculations in seconds that would have taken human computers days or weeks to complete. The women who programmed ENIAC, Betty Snyder, John Bartik, Kay McNulty, Marlon Westkoff, Ruth Lichterman, Francis Belis, learned the machine's architecture intimately, understood how pulses of electricity moved through the circuits, how to diagnose problems when tubes failed, which happened frequently. They became the first true programmers. Though their contributions would be overlooked for decades, their work classified, their names absent from early histories. ENIAC was completed in 1945, just as the war was ending. Its first problems were peaceful, calculating tables for engineers, but also running calculations for the hydrogen bomb project, processing numbers that describe the physics of fusion, the enormous energies involved, the conditions that might allow humanity to recreate the power of stars. There's something profound in the fact that these early computers, built during wartime with military funding for military purposes, contained within them the seeds of transformation that would touch every aspect of human life, that the same machines designed to calculate destruction would eventually evolve into tools for creation, for communication, for preserving memory and knowledge. The late 1940s saw rapid evolution. John von Neumann, a mathematician of extraordinary range, working at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, proposed a new architecture, a way of organizing computers that would become foundational, the von Neumann architecture, where both instructions and data were stored in the same memory, where programs could be modified by the computer itself, where software became as important as hardware. This might seem like a subtle distinction, but it changed everything. It meant that computers could be general-purpose machines, not hardwired for a single calculation, but flexible, capable of running different programs, of being transformed by the instructions fed into them. The hardware remained the same, but the behavior could be completely different depending on what was stored in memory. The EDVAC, Electronic Discrete Variable Automatic Computer, was designed with this architecture in mind, though it wasn't completed until 1952. By then, other machines had already implemented von Neumann's ideas. The Manchester Baby, built at the University of Manchester in England, ran its first program in June of 1948, a small machine by the standards of ENIAC, containing only 544 vacuum tubes, but it was the first stored program computer to actually run, to execute instructions that were held in electronic memory rather than set by cables and switches. The program it ran was simple, designed to find the highest factor of a number. It ran for 52 minutes, cycling through calculations, and when it completed, it had proven something fundamental, that von Neumann's architecture worked, that computers could be programmed in software rather than hardware, that a new era had begun. At Cambridge, Morris Wilks and his team built EDSAC, the Electronic Delay Storage Automatic Calculator, which began operating in May of 1949. It used mercury delay lines for memory, tubes filled with mercury where sound waves would travel, carrying pulses of information, the pulses bouncing back and forth, circulating through the tubes, each tube storing a few dozen numbers. The technology seems almost archaic now, using sound waves in liquid metal as a form of memory, but it worked. It was practical, and EDSAC ran for years, calculating problems in physics and engineering, becoming the first computer to provide a regular computing service to users. Wilks also developed one of the first assembly languages, a way of writing programs using symbolic instructions rather than pure binary, making it easier for humans to express algorithms, to think in terms that were closer to mathematics than to raw machine operations. And with that, programming began to become a craft, a discipline, something that required not just mathematical knowledge, but also a kind of creative problem-solving, a way of breaking down complex tasks into sequences of simple operations that a machine could execute. In America, UNIVAC-1, the Universal Automatic Computer, was completed in 1951, the first computer produced commercially in the United States. Remington Rand manufactured it, selling the first unit to the Census Bureau, bringing the story full circle back to Hollerith's punched cards. But now the processing was electronic, vastly faster, capable of handling the complexity of a modern census with something approaching ease. UNIVAC became famous in 1952 when it predicted the outcome of the presidential election, Eisenhower versus Stevenson. The CBS network had arranged to use UNIVAC to forecast results based on early returns. The machine predicted a landslide for Eisenhower, but the human experts didn't believe it, thought the computer must be wrong. So CBS waited to announce the prediction, and then, as the votes came in, the prediction proved accurate. The machine had seen patterns that the human analysts had missed, and suddenly the public began to understand that computers might be more than just calculating machines, that they might process information in ways that exceeded human capability. The 1950s brought a peculiar atmosphere to the world of computing. These machines still occupied entire rooms, still required teams of specialists to operate, still consumed enormous amounts of power, and yet they were becoming less rare, moving from military laboratories into universities, into government agencies, into the research departments of large corporations. IBM, which had been manufacturing punched card equipment for decades, began to take computing seriously, investing in research, in development, in the production of machines that could be leased to businesses. The IBM 701, announced in 1952, was designed for business applications, not scientific calculations. It could read and write magnetic tape, process records, sort data, generate reports, the kind of work that businesses needed, accounting, inventory, payroll, and with each installation, computing moved a little further from the exclusive domain of mathematicians and physicists, began to touch the ordinary operations of commerce and administration. There was still an almost mystical quality to these machines, the way they filled rooms with their presence, rows of cabinets lined with electronics, panels of blinking lights, the whir of magnetic tape drives spinning, starting and stopping, the chatter of line printers hammering characters onto paper, operators moving between the machines, loading tapes, checking printouts, monitoring the status lights for signs of trouble. Vacuum tubes still failed regularly. Each machine had spare tubes on hand, and technicians who knew how to diagnose problems, how to locate the failed component among thousands, replace it, bring the machine back to life. Programming these machines required a deep understanding of their architecture, how memory was organized, how arithmetic operations were performed, how input and output worked. Early programmers worked with machine code, pure sequences of binary numbers, each instruction specifying an operation and the memory addresses it would work with. It was painstaking, error-prone. A single wrong digit could crash the entire program, and debugging meant poring over printouts, tracing the flow of execution, trying to understand where logic had gone wrong. Grace Hopper, working at Remington Rand, began developing what she called a compiler, a program that could translate more human-readable instructions into machine code. She believed that programmers shouldn't need to work at the level of individual machine instructions, that there should be a layer of abstraction, a way to write programs that described what you wanted to accomplish rather than exactly how the machine should do it. Her work led to Flowmatic, one of the first high-level programming languages, designed to look almost like English, to be readable by people who weren't electronics experts. This was revolutionary. The idea that you could write something like compare price to budget and have a compiler translate that into the dozens or hundreds of machine instructions needed to actually perform the comparison. It meant that programming could become more accessible, that business analysts could potentially write programs, that the bottleneck of having too few programmers might be eased. In 1957, an IBM team led by John Backus released Fortran, Formula Translation. Designed for scientific and engineering calculations, it allowed mathematicians to write programs using notation that looked like algebra, equations that the computer would solve, loops that would iterate through calculations, subroutines that could be called repeatedly, suddenly, Programming became less about managing the machine and more about expressing algorithms, about solving problems. The late 50s also saw the invention of the transistor becoming practical for computing. Transistors had been invented at Bell Labs in 1947, tiny semiconductor devices that could amplify or switch electronic signals, much smaller than vacuum tubes, much more reliable, consuming far less power, generating far less heat, but it took years to develop manufacturing techniques to make them cheap enough, reliable enough to replace tubes in computers. The first transistorized computers appeared in the late 1950s, machines that were dramatically smaller than their vacuum tube predecessors, that could run for days without component failures, that used a fraction of the power. The TX0 at MIT, built in 1956, demonstrated what was possible, and soon manufacturers were racing to build fully transistorized machines. The IBM 7090, the Control Data 1604, each generation smaller, faster, more reliable than the last, and then, quietly, another revolution was beginning at Texas Instruments and at Fairchild Semiconductor. Engineers were figuring out how to build not just individual transistors, but entire circuits on single pieces of silicon, the integrated circuit, multiple transistors and resistors and capacitors, all fabricated together on a chip smaller than a fingernail. Jack Kilby at Texas Instruments demonstrated the first working integrated circuit in September of 1958, and Robert Noyce at Fairchild developed a practical manufacturing process. Soon after, this changed the trajectory of everything, because integrated circuits meant that complexity no longer required physical size. You could pack more and more components into the same space, or make the same capability smaller and smaller. The room-sized computers of the 1950s could, in principle, eventually fit on a desk, or in a briefcase, or in a pocket. Through the 1960s, computing expanded in multiple directions at once. IBM released the System /360 in 1964, a family of computers that all used the same instruction set, the same software, but came in different sizes and speeds. A business could start with a smaller model and upgrade to a larger one without rewriting all their programs. This concept of compatibility, of a platform that could grow, was transformative for commercial computing. Meanwhile, time-sharing systems were being developed, ways to allow multiple users to interact with a single computer simultaneously, each user at their own terminal, a teletype machine or a CRT display, connected by cable or phone line to the central computer, which would rapidly switch between users, giving each one a slice of computing time, so fast that it felt like you had the machine to yourself. This made computing interactive for the first time. Instead of submitting a batch job and waiting hours for results, you could type a command and see the response immediately, have a conversation with the machine, explore ideas iteratively. At MIT, Project Mac, the multiple access computer, demonstrated time sharing at scale, dozens of users connected to a single mainframe, each one running programs, editing text, compiling code, the system managing all the competing demands for memory and processor time. And from this emerged a culture of interactive computing, of terminals in offices and laboratories, of researchers who could test ideas quickly, who could develop software incrementally, seeing results as they worked rather than days later. The mini-computer revolution began in the mid-60s. Companies like Digital Equipment corporation building smaller, less expensive machines, not as powerful as IBM mainframes, but affordable for departments, for laboratories, for applications where a full mainframe was overkill, the PDP series, starting with the PDP-1 in 1960, then the PDP-8, which became the first mass-produced mini-computer, over 50,000 units sold, each one about the size of a refrigerator, costing thousands of dollars instead of millions, bringing computing within reach of universities, research groups, even some wealthy individuals. Ken Thompson and Dennis Ritchie at Bell Labs, working on a PDP-7 and later a PDP-11, developed Unix, an operating system that would influence computing for decades. Unix was elegant, built on simple principles. Everything is a file. Small tools that do one thing well and can be combined. A hierarchical file system. Text-based configuration. It was written partly in C, a programming language Ritchie developed, which made Unix portable, able to run on different hardware with relatively little modification, and Unix spread through universities, where students learned its philosophy, carried it with them into industry. The 1970s brought the microprocessor, Intel's 4004, released in 1971, a complete central processing unit on a single chip, designed originally for a calculator, but containing the essential elements of a computer: arithmetic logic, control logic, registers for temporary storage. It was a 4-bit processor capable of processing 4 binary digits at a time, not powerful by any measure, but it was a processor on a chip. And soon Intel released the 8008, then the 8080 8-bit processors that were powerful enough to build real computers around. And people began to do exactly that. Hobbyists, electronics enthusiasts, people who had never had access to computing before. The Altair 8800, released in 1975 as a kit, sold by mail order from MITS in Albuquerque. It had no keyboard, no display, just switches on the front panel to enter programs, lights to show the state of memory, but it had an Intel 8080 processor, and it cost less than $400. Suddenly, computing was accessible. You could own a computer in your home, learn it intimately, program it yourself. The Altair created a community. Clubs formed. The Homebrew Computer Club in Silicon Valley, where enthusiasts gathered to share designs, to show off their projects, to trade software. Bill Gates and Paul Allen wrote a version of BASIC for the Altair, one of the first programs available for it, and that BASIC interpreter became the foundation of their company. Microsoft. Software was becoming a product, not just something that came bundled with hardware, but something valuable in itself. Other computers followed. The Apple I, designed by Steve Wozniak, sold mostly to hobbyists. Then the Apple II in 1977, which was different. It came assembled in a plastic case with a keyboard. It could display color graphics on a television. It had expansion slots so users could add capabilities, disk drives, printer interfaces, modems, and it came with BASIC built into ROM. Turn it on, and you could start programming immediately. No need to load software from tape first. The Apple II became the first successful personal computer, selling millions of units over its production life, finding its way into homes, into schools, into small businesses. People used it for games, for education, for writing, for managing finances, For the first time, computing was something that individuals could own, could explore, could make part of their daily lives without needing institutional access or specialized training. Around the same time, Commodore released the PET. Tandy released the TRS-80, each offering their own vision of personal computing, and the software ecosystem began to grow. VisiCalc, the first spreadsheet program, released for the Apple II in 1979, transformed how people thought about personal computers. Suddenly, a computer wasn't just a toy or a curiosity. It was a tool that could save hours of work, that could model business scenarios, that could pay for itself in productivity. VisiCalc alone drove thousands of Apple II sales, people buying the hardware specifically to run that one program. The early 1980s saw computing become increasingly commercial, increasingly mainstream. IBM, which had dominated business computing with mainframes, entered the personal computer market in 1981 with the IBM PC. They designed it quickly using off-the-shelf components, an Intel 8088 processor, an open architecture that other companies could build hardware for, and crucially, they licensed the operating system, MS-DOS, from Microsoft rather than developing their own. This decision would have profound consequences because it meant that the operating system wasn't tied exclusively to IBM's hardware. Within months, other companies began producing IBM PC clones, compatible machines that could run the same software. Compaq, leading the way with a portable PC, then dozens of other manufacturers, each competing on price and features, but all running MS-DOS, all capable of running the growing library of PC software. Word processors like WordStar and later WordPerfect, spreadsheets like Lotus 123, databases like DBase. The PC became a platform, an ecosystem, and Microsoft, controlling the operating system, found itself at the center of that ecosystem. Meanwhile, Apple was pursuing a different vision. In 1984, they released the Macintosh, a computer built around a graphical user interface, windows, icons, a mouse pointer. The idea had been pioneered at Xerox PARC, the Palo Alto Research Center, where researchers had built experimental systems with graphical interfaces in the 1970s. But Apple brought it to the mass market, made it affordable, made it elegant. The Macintosh showed that computers didn't have to be intimidating, didn't require memorizing commands. You could point and click, drag and drop, see what you were doing represented visually on screen. The Mac struggled commercially at first. It was more expensive than PCs, had less software, but it found a devoted following among creative professionals, designers, publishers, educators, and it established that graphical interfaces were the future. Even Microsoft recognized this, spent years developing Windows, a graphical shell for MS-DOS, trying to match what Apple had achieved. The early versions were crude, but by Windows 3.1 in 1992, and especially Windows 95, the PC world had embraced the graphical paradigm that the Mac had pioneered. Through the 1980s, computers became faster, memory became cheaper, hard drives replaced floppy disks for storage, modems allowed computers to communicate over phone lines, bulletin board systems emerged, individuals running computers with phone lines connected, creating spaces where people could leave messages, share files, play games together. These were precursors to the internet, small networks, local communities, but they demonstrated the hunger for connection, for communication through computers. The internet itself, which had existed since the 1960s as ARPANET, a research network connecting universities and government facilities, began to open up, expand, new networks joined, protocols were standardized, TCP/IP became the common language by the late 1980s. The internet was no longer just for researchers, though it was still primarily text-based, email, news groups, FTP for file transfer, Telnet for remote login. You needed to know commands, understand protocols. But for those who learned, it offered a window into a global conversation, into resources scattered across continents. And then, in 1991, Tim Berners-Lee at CERN, the European Physics Laboratory, released the World Wide Web, a system for linking documents across the internet using hypertext. You could click on a link and jump to another document anywhere in the world. The first web browsers were simple, text-based, but they demonstrated the concept. And when Mosaic, a graphical web browser, was released in 1993, suddenly the web became accessible, visual. You could see images in line with text, navigate by clicking, browse without understanding the underlying technology. The web grew exponentially from a few hundred websites in 1993 to millions by the late 90s. Everyone wanted a presence online. Businesses, universities, individuals creating personal pages. Early search engines like Yahoo and later Google helped people navigate this expanding universe of information, and computing, which had been about calculation, about processing data, about running applications, became increasingly about connection, about communication, about accessing information stored on distant servers. The late 90s saw the rise of laptops as practical machines, no longer expensive curiosities, but genuine alternatives to desktop computers, portable computing, powerful enough to run the same software, thin and light enough to carry batteries that lasted hours, and wireless networking, first through cellular modems, then through Wi-Fi, meant that computing could happen anywhere, in coffee shops, in airports, in homes without network cables snaking through walls. The 2000s brought computing into daily life in ways that would have seemed impossible just decades earlier. Social networking sites emerged. Friendster, MySpace, then Facebook, creating persistent online identities, networks of connections, streams of updates from friends and acquaintances. Computing became social, personal, integrated with human relationships and communication patterns. Search engines became portals to all human knowledge. Google's PageRank algorithm, launched in 1998, revolutionized how information was found, ranking pages by relevance and authority, making the web navigable later. Wikipedia, launched in 2001, demonstrated that collective knowledge creation could work, that thousands of volunteers could build an encyclopedia larger and more current than any printed reference, constantly updated, covering obscure topics alongside mainstream ones. Mobile phones, which had been simple communication devices, began incorporating computing power. Early smartphones like the BlackBerry focused on email, giving business users access to their messages anywhere, but the iPhone, released in 2007, reimagined what a mobile computer could be: a touchscreen interface, apps that could do almost anything: music, maps, games, photography, web browsing, all in a device that fit in a pocket. And the Android operating system, released soon after, brought similar capabilities to phones from dozens of manufacturers. Suddenly, computing was always available, always connected. People carried more processing power in their pockets than had filled rooms in the 1960s, and they used it constantly, checking email, browsing social media, navigating, photographing, messaging. Computing had dissolved into the fabric of daily life, become invisible through its ubiquity. Cloud computing emerged as major companies built massive data centers, server farms with thousands of machines, offering computing power and storage as a service. You didn't need to own a powerful computer anymore, could do intensive processing on remote servers, store files in the cloud, access them from any device. Computing became distributed, decentralized. Your phone, your laptop, your tablet, all windows into the same services, the same data, synchronized automatically. And through all these decades, from the enormous room-filling machines of the 1940s to the smartphones of the 21st century, one thing remained constant: the fundamental architecture that von Neumann described: processor, memory, storage, input, output. The principles remained the same even as the implementation changed beyond recognition, from vacuum tubes to transistors to integrated circuits to microprocessors with billions of transistors, from mercury delay lines to magnetic cores to silicon chips storing gigabytes, from punched cards to magnetic tape to hard drives to solid-state storage. The underlying concepts persisted, evolved, but never completely disappeared. And now, as we sit here in the glow of screens, in a world where computing is everywhere, in our phones and watches, in our cars and homes, in the infrastructure that powers cities, in the satellites orbiting overhead, it's worth remembering that quiet progression, that accumulation of ideas and innovations, each generation building on what came before, solving new problems, opening new possibilities. The remarkable thing about this history, this long arc from mechanical calculators to quantum computers being developed today, is how much of it was driven by human needs that never changed: the need to count, to remember, to communicate, to solve problems that exceeded the capacity of individual minds. What changed was the medium, the speed, the scale, but the fundamental impulse remained constant. There's a certain poetry in how computing evolved, how each breakthrough made possible by the last. Transistors couldn't have been integrated into circuits without understanding gained from building vacuum tube computers. Microprocessors couldn't have been designed without the accumulated knowledge of how processors worked at larger scales. The internet couldn't have grown without personal computers to connect. And those personal computers needed decades of miniaturization before they could sit on desks instead of filling rooms. And through it all, through every generation of technology, there were people, individuals with names and lives and struggles, who saw possibilities that others missed, who persisted through failures and setbacks, who built on each other's work, sometimes with credit, sometimes without. The women who programmed ENIAC, whose contributions went unrecognized for decades. The engineers at small companies who competed with giants. The hobbyists who believed that computing should belong to everyone, not just corporations and governments. Consider the languages that emerged: each one a different philosophy about how humans and machines should communicate. Fortran saying that programmers should think mathematically. COBOL arguing for business-readable code. C prioritizing efficiency and direct hardware access. Later languages like Python emphasizing readability and ease of learning. Each language embedded assumptions about what mattered, what problems were worth solving, how programmers should think, and the arguments that raged, debates that seemed technical but reflected deeper values, open source versus proprietary software, whether code should be freely shared or carefully protected, whether computing power should be centralized in data centers or distributed to individual devices, whether privacy or convenience should take precedence when those values conflicted. These weren't just technical questions, they were philosophical ones, about ownership, about control, about what kind of world we wanted to build with these powerful tools. The speed of change itself became a defining characteristic. Moore's law, the observation that the number of transistors on a chip doubled roughly every 2 years, held true for decades, meant that computers became exponentially more powerful. That last year's breakthrough became this year's baseline, became next year's obsolescence. People who learned to program on one generation of machines found their knowledge outdated within years, had to continuously adapt, learn new languages, new paradigms, new ways of thinking about problems. And yet some things persisted. Some programs written in the 1960s still run today, maintaining critical infrastructure, banking systems, air traffic control, because the cost and risk of replacing them exceeds the benefit. So modern programmers sometimes find themselves working with COBOL, with systems designed before they were born, maintaining bridges between past and present, ensuring continuity even as everything else changes. The story of computing is also a story about abstraction, about creating layers that hide complexity. Early programmers worked with machine code, ones and zeros, then came assembly language, symbolic names for operations, then high-level languages, then frameworks and libraries, each layer making it easier to build more complex things, allowing programmers to think at higher levels, to compose solutions from pre-built components, standing on ever taller towers of accumulated code. But abstraction has costs. Fewer people understand the lower levels, how data actually moves through circuits, how operating systems manage resources, how networks route packets. We build on foundations we don't fully understand, trust that the layers below us work correctly, and mostly they do. But when something breaks at a deep level, when a security flaw is discovered in fundamental protocols, when hardware behaves unexpectedly, the specialists who understand those depths become invaluable, keepers of knowledge that seems almost arcane. There's something dreamlike about the pace of transformation. Someone born when ENIAC was being built in the mid-1940s has lived through the entire computer age, from room-sized calculators to artificial intelligence, from punch cards to voice interfaces, from computers as rare institutional resources to computers as ubiquitous personal devices. The world they were born into and the world they inhabit now are almost unrecognizable to each other, and all of this change, this revolution, happened within a single human lifetime, and the changes continue, accelerating, if anything. Quantum computers beginning to demonstrate capabilities that classical computers struggle with. Artificial intelligence systems learning to perform tasks that seemed uniquely human, generate text, create images, drive cars, diagnose diseases. The boundaries of what machines can do keep expanding, pushing into territories we once thought belonged exclusively to human intelligence. But perhaps the most profound change is how computing has become invisible, woven so thoroughly into daily life that we barely notice it. The phone in your pocket contains millions of times more processing power than the computers that guided Apollo to the moon. And you use it to check messages, to share photos, to navigate, to listen to music. Computing has become infrastructure, like electricity or running water, something we depend on without thinking about until it stops working. The story circles back to those early dreams of mechanical calculation, to Babbage imagining engines of brass and iron, to Turing conceiving of universal machines, to the programmers setting switches on ENIAC. They were all reaching toward something, a vision of machines that could extend human capability, that could remember perfectly, calculate tirelessly, process information at scales beyond human capacity. And we've achieved that vision, exceeded it, built systems more complex and capable than those pioneers could have imagined. And yet, the fundamental questions remain: what should we do with this power? How do we ensure that computing serves human flourishing? How do we preserve privacy and autonomy in a world of constant connection? How do we prevent the tools we've built from amplifying our worst impulses along with our best? These aren't technical questions, they're human ones, and they require the same careful thought, the same patient problem solving, the same willingness to learn from mistakes that built the technology in the first place. Tonight, in this quiet moment, with the story told, we can appreciate the long journey, the countless innovations, the accumulated wisdom that brought us from mechanical gears to quantum bits, from rooms full of vacuum tubes to chips smaller than fingernails, from calculations that took days to computations that happen in nanoseconds. It's a story of human ingenuity, of collaboration across generations, of dreams made real through patient effort. And the story isn't finished, will never be finished, because each solution creates new problems. Each capability enables new questions. Each generation builds on what came before and reaches toward what comes next. The computers of tomorrow will seem as magical to us as today's smartphones would seem to those ENIAC programmers. And yet they'll be built on the same foundations, the same principles, the same human desire to understand, to calculate, to remember, to connect. So we let the story settle like dust after a long journey. And in the settling, we can see the path we've traveled, the distance we've come, the ingenuity and persistence required at every step, from the first mechanical calculators to the quantum computers being developed in laboratories today. It's all one continuous thread, one unfolding story, one long conversation between human minds and the machines they've built to extend their reach. The lights in the server rooms keep blinking. The electrons keep flowing through circuits. The data keeps moving through networks. And somewhere, someone is writing code, solving a problem, building something new, continuing the work, adding their contribution to this endless unfolding, this quiet revolution that began with gears and now encompasses the world. And in that ongoing work, in that patient building, there's something almost meditative, something that connects us to all those who came before, who sat at their desks and drawing boards, who soldered circuits and debugged code who imagine possibilities and work to make them real. The story continues, will always continue, as long as there are problems to solve, questions to answer, dreams to pursue, through circuits and silicon, through light and electricity, through the endless patient work of making machines think. The hum of the computers fades, becomes background, becomes silence, and in that silence the story rests, complete for now, but never truly finished, waiting for the next chapter, the next innovation, the next dreamer who will push the boundaries a little further, and the work goes on quietly, persistently, one calculation at a time,